Arthur Bennett arrived at the training camp on a cold morning, clutching a small suitcase filled with the few belongings he owned. The air smelled of damp earth and metal, and the distant bark of drill sergeants rang across the grounds. A reserved young man of 20, Arthur had left behind a quiet life in his English village, seeking purpose in a world torn apart by war. His first weeks were brutal, mud-soaked marches, tasteless rations, and sleepless nights in the biting cold. His tent mate was reassigned, and Arthur found himself alone, his cot feeling larger and lonelier with each passing night. That changed when Harry Thompson strode into the tent, his blonde hair shining in the morning light. "Arthur Bennett, I presume," he said with a cheeky grin, setting down his duffel bag. Arthur muttered a quiet confirmation, unsure of how to handle Harry's exuberance. By the end of their first conversation, Arthur realized Harry was unlike anyone he'd ever met. He was bold, confident, and unnervingly charming. Harry's arrival marked a shift in Arthur's life at the camp. Where Arthur was quiet and brooding, Harry was loud and magnetic. He had a knack for storytelling, spinning tales that left their tent ringing with laughter late into the night. One evening, as Arthur cleaned his boots, Harry leaned back on his cot, harmonica in hand. He played a soft, haunting tune, the kind that made Arthur pause and listen. "Where'd you learn that?" Arthur asked, his voice breaking the silence. Harry shrugged, a grin tugging at his lips. "My mum taught me. Said it'd get me out of trouble. Turns out she was half right." Arthur couldn't help but smile. Despite Harry's easy charm, there were moments when his blue eyes turned distant, as if he carried burdens he refused to share. Arthur began to wonder who Harry really was beneath the cheerful facade. Training became slightly more bearable with Harry by his side. They endured brutal drills together, sharing whispered jokes when the sergeants weren't looking. Harry introduced Arthur to his circle of friends: James Kingsley, sharp-tongued strategist; Larry, James's cheerful younger brother; and Jacob Timothy, a quiet but dependable presence. During a particularly grueling obstacle course, Arthur slipped in the mud, his hands and knees sinking into the cold, wet ground. Before the drill sergeant could bark an order, Harry was there, pulling Arthur to his feet with a firm grip. "Can't have you quitting on me now, mate," Harry said, his grin as bright as ever. Arthur thanked him with a nod, his heart swelling with gratitude. In those moments of shared struggle, Arthur began to realize that Harry wasn't just his tent mate, he was becoming his anchor. After weeks of grueling monotony, Harry proposed a daring idea: sneaking out of the barracks for an adventure. The others eagerly agreed, but Arthur hesitated. "You do realize we'll be scrubbing latrines for a month if we're caught, right?" he said, arms crossed. Harry simply winked. "Worth it." At dawn, they slipped through the camp's perimeter, their laughter muffled by the morning mist. After an hour of wandering, they stumbled upon a river, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. Arthur's face lit up with childlike wonder as he knelt by the bank, cupping the cool water in his hands. Harry, watching him with a fond smile, began to unbutton his shirt. "Care to join me for a swim?" he teased. Before Arthur could respond, the others leapt into the water, splashing him mercilessly. The group's laughter echoed through the woods as they played like boys again, forgetting, if only for a moment, the weight of the war. Back at camp, Harry's playful nature took on a softer edge. Arthur began finding small folded notes tucked under his cot, a few lines of poetry scrawled in Harry's messy handwriting. The words spoke of courage, hope, and longing, stirring something deep within Arthur. One night, as the others slept, Harry leaned over and whispered, "Did you like the poem?" Arthur nodded, his heart racing. "I didn't know you wrote," he said softly. Harry shrugged, his usual grin replaced by a shy smile. "Only when I've got something to say." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant drone of planes overhead, a grim reminder of the war looming around them. As Arthur lay awake that night, the weight of Harry's words lingered, filling the silence of the tent with unspoken possibilities. One stormy night, as rain lashed against the tent, Harry finally broke the tension that had been building between them. "Arthur," he began, his voice unusually serious. "There's something I need to say." Arthur turned to face him, his heart pounding. Harry's usual confidence faltered as he continued, I know, I care about you. More than I should." Arthur stared at him, the words sinking in like a stone. "You're mad," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Harry leaned closer, his blue eyes filled with vulnerability. "Say the word, and I'll stop. But if you feel even a fraction of what I do," his sentence trailed off, and Arthur, unable to hold back any longer, closed the distance between them. Their first kiss was desperate, a collision of fear and longing that left them both breathless. After that night, everything changed between Arthur and Harry. In the dim light of their tent, away from prying eyes, they would steal moments of closeness, Harry tracing circles on Arthur's wrist as they whispered to each other about dreams and fears. Their shared silence was a testament to the unspoken bond growing stronger by the day. But secrecy was their shield, any slip could lead to disastrous consequences. During drills, Harry would occasionally brush past Arthur, his fingers grazing his shoulder in a fleeting but deliberate gesture. It sent a jolt through Arthur each time, a reminder of what they had but couldn't openly claim. Their connection was intoxicating yet fraught with danger, every shared glance charged with the weight of their secret. They learned to speak in code, to share smiles without raising suspicion, but it became harder with each passing day to hide what they truly meant to each other. The next few weeks are filled with stolen moments of intimacy. They learn to navigate the fine line between love and survival, making love in their tent during the quiet hours of the night. Their touches are tender yet urgent, their kisses laced with the fear of being caught. Every rustle of fabric or creak of the floorboard sends their hearts racing, but they can't stop themselves. Their connection deepens, becoming a source of solace amidst the chaos of war. It wasn't long before James and Jacob started noticing the subtle changes between Arthur and Harry. James, ever observant, confronted Harry one evening while Arthur was out on duty. "You and Arthur," he began, his voice low. "There's something there, isn't there?" Harry hesitated, his usual grin faltering. "James, if you know what's good for us, you'll keep it to yourself." James held Harry's gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Your secret's safe with me." Jacob, on the other hand, found out in a more embarrassing way. He walked into the tent one evening unannounced and caught a glimpse of Harry leaning in too close to Arthur, their hands brushing. Jacob froze, then quietly backed out, muttering an apology. Later that night, he pulled Arthur aside. "Be careful," Jacob warned. "Not everyone's as understanding as I am." Arthur nodded, his throat tight with gratitude and fear. As the war dragged on, Arthur and Harry's moments of intimacy became more desperate. They clung to each other in the quiet hours of the night, their touches tender yet tinged with urgency. Arthur's cock creaked softly as Harry leaned over, his breath warm against Arthur's neck. "Do you ever think about after the war?" Harry murmured. Arthur swallowed hard, his heart aching. "I don't let myself. Feels too far away." Harry placed a hand on Arthur's cheek, forcing him to meet his gaze. "We'll get through this. Together." Their lovemaking was quiet, stifled by the fear of being overheard, but the intensity of their connection was undeniable. Every touch, every kiss, was a rebellion against the chaos around them. They found solace in each other, a fragile haven in a world gone mad. The day their unit received orders to move to the front lines was the day Arthur realized just how much he feared losing Harry. The camp buzzed with a mix of dread and determination as soldiers packed their gear and said their goodbyes. Arthur and Harry sat side by side on a fallen log, the weight of the news pressing down on them. "You scared?" Harry asked, his voice unusually soft. Arthur nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Not for me." "For you?" Harry reached over, his hand gripping Arthur's tightly. "We'll stick together. Always." That night, as the others slept, Arthur and Harry held each other closer than ever before. The thought of going into battle, of facing the possibility of death, was unbearable. But in the darkness of their tent, they made a silent promise: no matter what happened, they would find their way back to each other. War was nothing like the stories Arthur had heard growing up. The trenches were cold, muddy, and filled with the stench of death. Yet through it all, Harry was there, his presence a constant source of strength. During one particularly brutal skirmish, Arthur found himself pinned down by enemy fire. Fear gripped him, but then Harry appeared, pulling him to safety with a strength that belied his lean frame. "Don't you dare leave me, Bennett," Harry growled, his voice trembling with emotion. Arthur nodded, too shaken to speak. Later that night, as they huddled together in a makeshift shelter, Harry whispered, "I meant it, you know. I can't do this without you." Arthur squeezed his hand, the unspoken words hanging heavily between them. The war took its toll on their little group. During a deadly ambush, Larry was hit, his body crumpling to the ground as James screamed his name. The loss shattered them, especially James, who became withdrawn and distant. Harry and Arthur did their best to comfort him, but the weight of Larry's absence hung over them like a storm cloud. One night, James confided in Harry. "He was my little brother. I was supposed to protect him." Harry placed a hand on James's shoulder, his own grief etched into his face. "You did what you could. He'd want you to keep going." Jacob, ever the quiet one, became James's anchor, their bond deepening as they navigated their shared sorrow. For Arthur and Harry, Larry's death was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, and the urgency of their love. When the war finally ended, the surviving members of their unit were sent home, their spirits battered but unbroken. Arthur and Harry returned to England, their relationship stronger than ever but still hidden from the world. James and Jacob, having found solace in each other, decided to stay close, their friendship evolving into something deeper. The four of them often met in secret, their shared experiences creating a bond that no one else could understand. Arthur and Harry rented a small cottage in the countryside, where they could live without fear of judgment. In the privacy of their home, they allowed themselves to be fully free, kissing, laughing, and making love without restraint. The scars of the war lingered, but they found healing in each other's arms. Living in secrecy was both a blessing and a curse. While Arthur and Harry cherished their quiet life together, they were always aware of the world's harsh judgment. They pretended to be merely housemates when strangers visited, but behind closed doors, their love flourished. Harry took up writing, publishing poems under a pseudonym that spoke of love and resilience. Arthur found work as a carpenter, his hands finding solace in crafting something tangible and lasting. They spent their evenings by the fire, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Despite the challenges, they built a life filled with love and laughter, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. Years later, as they sat together in the garden of their cottage, Harry turned to Arthur with a smile. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" Arthur nodded, his heart full. "The best." They had weathered war, loss, and the constraints of a judgmental society, but their love had endured. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the countryside, Harry reached for Arthur's hand. "Whatever comes next, I'm glad it's with you." Arthur squeezed his hand, his voice steady. "Always." Together, they watched the world fade into twilight, their hearts beating as one, a love that had survived against all odds.